The dog's growl cut through the silence like a knife, low and rumbling. Jack's hand instinctively went to the sidearm at his hip, but he didn't draw it yet. Something was wrong. Echo's eyes fixed on the trees ahead, his body tense, ears pinned back. Jack stood motionless, the hairs on his neck standing up. His senses screamed at him, but the landscape was still nothing moved. Then a shadow shifted in the distance. Jack stepped forward, heart pounding, but before he could take another breath, Echo bolted straight into the dark. The dog knew something Jack didn't, and now so did he. What had Echo found? And was it too late to stop it? Jack hesitated for a heartbeat, eyes locked on the darkened edge of the clearing. Echo's growl grew more intense, vibrating in his chest. The dog had never reacted like this, not in the years they'd spent together, not in the worst of their deployments. The unsettling calm around them had fractured, replaced by an oppressive tension that Jack couldn't shake. The air felt heavier now, the world holding its breath. Jack scanned the horizon again, every muscle coiled, waiting for a sign. The wind shifted, and for the briefest moment, the scent of something unfamiliar reached his nose, metal, smoke, and something darker, more sinister. His instincts screamed at him to move, but Echo was already ahead, darting into the shadows without a sound. Jack followed no time for second thoughts, his boots crunching against the gravel. The dog's silhouette was barely visible against the darkened backdrop of trees, moving with purpose, with urgency. He quickened his pace, pulse hammering in his ears. But just as he reached the spot where Echo had disappeared, he froze. A figure stood motionless in the dark, watching him. Jack's breath caught. This wasn't a random intruder. This was something much worse. But who were they really hunting? The wilderness surrounding the outpost was both an old friend and a relentless adversary. It whispered of danger in the creaking of the trees and the shifting shadows that seemed to grow deeper with every passing second. The forest had its own language, one Jack Westbrook had learned to understand over years of service in places far less serene. But tonight, something in the air felt different, tense, electric, as if the world was holding its breath, waiting for something. Jack pulled his jacket tighter against the cool evening breeze that swept across the open expanse. The stars overhead, scattered like diamonds across the velvet sky, offered little comfort. He preferred the night there was clarity in the darkness, a clarity he couldn't find when surrounded by people. Here, away from the noise and the chaos, his thoughts could be his own. He could breathe without the weight of expectations pressing down on him. But tonight, even the solitude felt heavier than usual. Beside him, Echo trotted quietly through the underbrush, his movements smooth and deliberate. The dog's presence was the only constant in Jack's world these days, his loyal companion, the one creature in this life that still anchored him to something real. It wasn't just the bond of service or the shared experiences in the field, it was the silence between them, the understanding that didn't require words. Echo knew Jack better than anyone, maybe better than Jack knew himself. The past was never far behind. Jack's military service had shaped every part of him, from his posture to his worldview. Years of combat had taught him to read situations, to trust his instincts, and above all to keep moving. The war had taken so much from him, his comrades, his sense of peace, his very identity. But somehow he had survived, and somehow so had Echo. They walked side by side, the dog's gait unhurried yet purposeful. Jack's boots crunched softly on the gravel path, his steps more measured than they had been when he first arrived at the outpost. It had been months since he'd returned home, if he could even call it that. The echoes of the past hadn't gone away. They clung to him, layered beneath his skin like a second layer of armor. And sometimes in the quiet moments like this, he could almost hear them, voices from long-gone days, their laughter mingling with the sound of gunfire. The wind shifted, carrying with it the scent of pine and damp earth mixed with something else, something unfamiliar. Jack stopped his body, instinctively going, rigid eyes narrowing as he scanned the shadows. Echo stopped too, his ears flicking back his tail, stiff with tension. The dog's nose twitched, a signal Jack had come to trust. Something was wrong. But what? The air felt too still, too quiet. "Easy, Echo," Jack murmured, his voice barely above a whisper. The dog didn't move, but the low growl building in his throat was enough to tell Jack the danger was real. It wasn't just the usual feeling of unease that came with being out in the wild. This was different. Jack's hand hovered near the holster at his side. He wasn't sure if the gesture was out of habit or genuine concern, but his fingers found the comforting weight of the gun anyway. The silence stretched thick and heavy, pressing in from all sides. Jack scanned the area again, but there was nothing, no movement, no sign of life beyond the trees. Only the occasional rustle of leaves and the soft hum of the wind through the branches. But Jack knew better than to ignore his instincts. The silence wasn't normal. And Echo knew it too. The dog's growl deepened, rising from his chest like the rumble of distant thunder. Echo's posture shifted as he crouched lower his body, coiling, ready to spring at a moment's notice. Jack's heart rate picked up his breath, steadying, as he reached for his rifle, moving quietly, so as not to alert whatever danger lurked ahead. He didn't want to make any unnecessary noise. The element of surprise was his best chance of getting out of this unscathed. "Stay close," Jack whispered, though he knew the dog had already picked up on it. Echo didn't need the words. He was always there, always alert, always ready to act. Together they made an unmatched team. Jack moved cautiously, the world around him dissolving into a quiet blur as his focus narrowed to the shadows ahead. Every step was measured, deliberate. He had learned long ago that in moments like these, hesitation could cost you everything. And yet the longer he moved forward, the stronger the sensation that something wasn't right gnawed at him. The air felt thick, as if it were closing in, suffocating him with the weight of something unseen. Then, without warning, Echo lunged. Jack barely had time to react before the dog's body shot forward, his paws crunching through the underbrush as he raced toward the trees. Jack's heart skipped a beat as he sprinted after him, rifle and hand muscles pushing him forward despite the tightening feeling in his chest. He tried to focus on Echo, on staying in sync with the dog's movements, but his mind was racing. What had caused the dog to react like that? What had Echo sensed that Jack hadn't? They plunged deeper into the woods, the moonlight barely breaking through the thick canopy above. The shadows were impenetrable, shifting and stretching in odd angles as they raced through the uneven terrain. Echo was ahead now, his form barely visible, but Jack could hear his breathing steady and rhythmic, guiding him forward. Suddenly, the dog stopped. Jack skidded to a halt, his boots sliding on the loose gravel beneath him. Echo stood motionless, his eyes locked on something just beyond the trees, his body tense and coiled. Jack's hand went instinctively to the rifle, but he didn't raise it yet. Not yet. He followed Echo's gaze, scanning the shadows. He saw nothing. Not at first, but then just barely a flicker of movement. Something or someone was out there lurking just beyond his vision. A figure, tall and indistinct, moving with a purpose that felt too controlled, too deliberate to be an animal. Jack's breath hitched in his throat as his heart began to pound in his chest. The dog's growl intensified, a low, guttural sound that seemed to vibrate in Jack's bones. Echo didn't move, but his eyes never left the figure in the distance. Jack felt his pulse quicken, his body going cold. His instinct screamed at him to act, to do something, but the figure remained, still standing just beyond the trees, watching. Jack swallowed, fingers tight on his rifle. Whoever or whatever this was, it was no coincidence. Jack had learned to trust his instincts in moments like this, but this time something was off. Everything felt wrong, but he couldn't quite put his finger on it. Echo Jack whispered, his voice barely audible. "Stay with me." But Echo didn't move. The dog's attention was fixed entirely on the figure. Jack's pulse hammered in his ears, drowning out everything else. His mind raced, piecing together the little bits of information he had, but it wasn't enough. Not nearly enough. The figure raised a hand, slow and deliberate, signaling something or someone Jack couldn't see. Jack's throat went dry. Every muscle in his body tensed, preparing for whatever was coming next. "Who are you?" Jack called, his voice carrying across the clearing. The words were a challenge, not a question. He didn't expect an answer, but the figure didn't respond. Instead, they simply stood there, their presence felt more than seen. Echo's growl softened, but the dog didn't relax. Jack's hand tightened around the rifle, but his body remained still. They both waited, locked in an uneasy stalemate with the unknown. Then, without warning, the figure turned and disappeared into the shadows, moving with the same grace and silence as before. Jack stood motionless, his breath coming in shallow gasps. The forest was still again, but this time the silence felt oppressive. The shadows seemed to press in closer, the weight of the unknown settling over Jack like a dark cloud. "What the hell just happened?" Jack muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. Echo stood beside him, his body still tense, but his gaze never leaving the spot where the figure had been. Jack felt the dog's silent understanding wash over him. Echo had known something Jack didn't, and Jack wasn't sure whether that made him feel more safe or more vulnerable. He lowered his rifle, but only slightly. His grip still tight, his senses still on edge. He didn't know who that figure was or what they wanted, but he was certain of one thing: they weren't just passing through. Whatever game was being played, Jack was now a part of it, and Echo had been the one to lead him to it. Jack exhaled slowly, his mind racing with questions, but none of them had answers. He glanced down at the dog, who met his gaze with steady eyes full of quiet wisdom. Echo had seen things, knew things that Jack would never understand. But tonight, that knowledge was no longer a comfort. It was a warning, and Jack was listening. The night air was thick with the scent of pine and wet earth as Jack Westbrook made his way back toward the outpost. The shadows around him were long and shifting, stretched out by the fading light of the full moon. Echo, his ever-watchful shepherd, walked beside him, moving silently through the underbrush. The dog's ears flicked occasionally at the rustling sounds in the distance, small creatures no doubt, but Jack was more attuned to the unsettling feeling that had been gnawing at him all evening. Something about tonight felt different. They had covered miles already, the distance between Jack and the camp growing longer with each step. The familiar sights and sounds of the outpost, the hum of generators, the distant chatter of guards seemed far behind him, now swallowed by the dense forest. But in this quiet wilderness there were no distractions. The isolation was a double-edged sword, offering a rare sense of peace, but it also amplified the unease that had been following Jack ever since he'd first felt Echo's strange behavior earlier. There was no reason to be on edge, no reason for the paranoia creeping along the edges of his mind. But Jack couldn't shake the feeling that something was waiting for him, something in the dark. And Echo knew it too. The dog had been alert all evening, his senses stretched, taut, his eyes darting between the trees as if he could sense something Jack couldn't. He pushed the thought away, trying to refocus. Get back to the camp. Focus on the mission. That was all that mattered. The briefings, the debriefs, the silence of the outpost, none of it made sense, but it was part of the routine now. Jack had come to accept the rhythm of life on the outskirts, where nothing really changed except the seasons and the faces of the men and women who came and went. There was comfort in the routine, even if it was a comfort built on avoidance. Easy, Echo, Jack muttered, but the dog was already ahead, his ears cocked forward. His movements were precise, his pace quickening, as if he were being pulled by an unseen force. Jack's hand drifted to the pistol at his side instinctively, though he didn't draw it. Not yet. Echo had been more than a companion to him. The dog had become a trusted extension of his instincts, and Jack knew that when Echo acted with such certainty, it meant something was off. They had both been through too much to ignore the signs now. Jack moved forward, his boots crunching quietly against the damp forest floor. The shadows closed in around him, thickening as the trees grew denser. The camp felt miles away now, though it was just beyond the tree line. He could barely make out the faint glow of the perimeter lights in the distance, but that light now seemed distant enough to feel almost foreign. He wasn't sure why, but tonight the line between safe and dangerous had blurred. Echo stopped again, this time standing still with his body low to the ground, head angled toward the dark woods in front of them. Jack's chest tightened and the hairs on his neck prickled as his heart skipped a beat. The dog's focus was total, unwavering. Something was out there, something Jack couldn't see. "Stay close," Jack whispered, but his voice was almost lost in the growing tension. There was no sound in the woods now, no rustling, no animals. Just the stillness, as if the entire forest was waiting for something to happen. Then, out of nowhere, Jack heard it barely audible at first, a faint rustling sound in the distance. Not a breeze, not a creature. This was deliberate. Someone or something was moving through the underbrush. Echo's body tensed, his growl building low in his chest. Jack's eyes flicked over the dark trees, searching for movement, but he saw nothing. He wasn't sure whether he should be relieved or more terrified. His gut told him to act, but he wasn't sure what he was up against. The figure he had seen earlier, if it had been a figure at all, seemed to be a ghost vanishing into the woods. But now the atmosphere was different. It felt like the calm before a storm, like the earth itself was bracing for something. The rustling grew louder, closer. Jack's grip tightened on the handle of his rifle. He moved slowly, deliberately, feeling the adrenaline surge in his chest. His instinct screamed at him to be ready to act first, but Echo remained focused, his eyes tracking something Jack couldn't yet see. The dog was ready. Jack wasn't. The sound of the movement stopped suddenly. Complete silence fell. The kind of silence that rang in Jack's ears, thick and suffocating. He didn't dare breathe too loudly, didn't dare make a sound that might give away his position. He stood stock-still, eyes scanning the trees in front of him. Then the sound came again, a voice. Soft, almost a whisper, but clear enough to reach Jack's ears in the stillness of the woods. "Westbrook," the voice said, sharp and clear, but unrecognizable. "You're looking for something, aren't you?" Jack froze. His heart skipped, and his mind raced. How did they know his name? Echo's growl deepened. The hairs on Jack's neck stood up. The voice was too calm, too knowing. There was no reason for anyone to be out here, let alone someone who knew his name. His mind raced through every possible scenario, every face he'd seen at the outpost, every threat he might have overlooked. But nothing fit. "Who's there?" Jack called, his voice steadier than he felt. His rifle was now raised, trained on the space where the voice had come from, but the shadows were impenetrable. The trees, the thick underbrush, the night, it all seemed to swallow up the figure. The response came almost immediately, soft yet menacing. "You've been looking for answers, haven't you?" The voice was closer now, just beyond the tree line, almost as if the person had moved toward him without making a sound. "But you won't find them here. Not yet." Jack's breath caught in his throat. His finger hovered over the trigger of his rifle, his grip tightening with each passing second. Why the cryptic message? What did they know? And then just like that, the figure stepped into the dim light filtering through the trees, a shadow tall and wiry, their face hidden by the hood of a dark cloak. Jack's heart skipped a beat as his body instinctively tensed. Was this an ambush? Was this the trap he had been expecting? The figure's face was obscured, but Jack could see the outline of their posture, the way they moved. It wasn't the carefree movement of a simple wanderer. No. This person was here with purpose. Before Jack could react, the figure's hand raised slowly, a signal. "You're not ready for this," they said, the tone quiet but firm, almost as though they were speaking to someone much younger, much less experienced. "But you will be." Then the figure turned, disappearing into the night as quickly as they had appeared, their presence swallowed by the darkness once more. "Damn it," Jack muttered under his breath, his mind racing. His heart was pounding in his chest, his breath ragged. He wanted to chase after them, demand answers. But something in the back of his mind told him this wasn't a chase he could win. Whoever that person was, they had the upper hand. He exhaled slowly, eyes still scanning the trees, but the figure was gone. Echo too stood still, his body relaxed. Now, though, Jack knew the dog was still on high alert. Jack felt a shiver crawl down his spine as the realization hit him this wasn't a random encounter. Whoever had been watching him, whoever had known his name, they weren't finished. They had set something in motion, and Jack had just stepped into a game much bigger than he could have imagined. A game that had begun with the first whisper in the wind. Jack took a deep breath and turned toward the outpost, his legs heavy with uncertainty. He knew deep down that nothing would be the same from this moment forward. The hunt had started, and this time he wasn't the one doing the hunting. Jack couldn't shake the feeling that the world had shifted beneath his feet. The silence around him, heavy and oppressive, clung to him as he made his way back to the outpost. Echo was still with him, his senses on high alert, but Jack felt the weight of uncertainty in every step. That figure, whoever they were, hadn't just left a mark on the night. They'd left a mark on Jack, like a scar that he couldn't ignore. The moonlight cut through the trees, casting long, twisting shadows that seemed to move on their own. Jack kept his hand near his rifle, but now the instinctive tension had melted into a gnawing frustration. He didn't know who the figure was. He didn't know what they wanted. But the cryptic words they had left him with still echoed in his mind. "You're not ready for this. But you will be." He wasn't ready for it. He wasn't ready for whatever had been set in motion. As Jack trudged forward, the sounds of the forest began to feel like an assault. The cracking of branches, the distant chirp of birds, the rustling of leaves, all of it seemed to conspire against his peace of mind. It wasn't until Echo's sudden stop, his body going rigid again, that Jack's focus snapped back into the present. The dog's eyes were fixed on something ahead, his muscles taut with an unspoken warning. Jack cursed under his breath and crouched, instinctively reaching for his rifle. It had been too long since he'd felt this uneasy, too long since something had made him question the reality he had built for himself. He thought he was done with the ghosts of his past, the memories, the betrayals, the old wounds that still festered in the back of his mind. But now it seemed like the past was clawing its way back into his life, and Jack had no idea who or what was behind it. The wind picked up, whipping through the trees. Jack felt it against his face, the sting of cold air reminding him that the world was still turning, that life was still moving whether he was ready for it or not. He glanced down at Echo, who had begun to move forward cautiously, as if the dog already knew what was coming. Jack followed, trying to stay silent. The minutes stretched into what felt like hours, the world narrowing to the space between himself and the invisible threat ahead. Then ahead he saw it, a flicker of motion between the trees. But this wasn't the phantom figure from earlier. No, this was something else. A group of men moving quickly but deliberately, their dark figures blending into the night. Jack's breath caught in his throat as he recognized their movements. They were trained just like him. Silent, efficient, working as one. His hand tightened around the rifle, but he held his ground. There was no immediate danger, not yet, but the presence of these men, whoever they were, felt wrong, felt ominous. And it wasn't just their movements that made Jack uneasy. It was the equipment they carried. The rifles, the gear. It wasn't military grade. Not exactly. It was more sophisticated, specialized. Like they weren't just another group of soldiers or mercenaries. They were someone else. Someone far more dangerous. Jack's mind raced as the men moved deeper into the forest, and instinctively he dropped to one knee, pulling Echo into a crouch beside him. The dog's eyes never left the men, his body ready to spring into action. Jack's breath came slow and steady as he surveyed the area. He needed answers. He needed to know who these people were, what they wanted, and why they were so close to the outpost. But the more Jack thought about it, the more he realized that this wasn't just a random encounter. These men were here for a reason, and Jack had no idea what that reason was. He had no choice but to follow them. They were the key to understanding what was really happening. The hunt had truly begun now. As Jack moved carefully through the trees trying to keep pace with the group ahead, the weight of his past settled back over him. He couldn't stop thinking about the figure from earlier, the one who had whispered to him in the woods, the one who had known his name, the one who had seemed so out of place. How did they know who he was? What connection did they have to this group of men? In the midst of the darkness, Jack felt something stir in the back of his mind, something deep and unsettling. He had been trained to handle threats to survive, to think in terms of objectives and outcomes. But this felt different. There was no clear enemy, no clear goal, just shadows, whispers, and the constant feeling of being watched. And then, as if the thought had summoned it, Jack felt a presence behind him. Something cold distant watching him from the edges of the forest. A crack of a branch. A footstep too quiet but close enough that Jack could feel the shift in the air. He spun around, rifle raised, but there was nothing. Only the trees. Only the moonlight filtering through the canopy. Echo growled low in his chest, his eyes scanning the area. Jack stood, frozen heart racing, every muscle tense. He wasn't alone anymore, but the silence of the night closed in around him again, and whatever presence had been there, it had disappeared. Jack exhaled sharply, trying to steady his breathing. He couldn't afford to be distracted. He had to keep moving. The men ahead, the ones with the strange gear, had no idea he was following them. That was a small comfort. They hadn't noticed him yet. But Jack knew they wouldn't be so careless for long. The deeper into the woods he moved, the more unsettled he became. It wasn't just the unfamiliar presence stalking him. It was the sense of familiarity creeping back into his bones, the way his training kicked in automatically, the way his instincts had always been sharper when he was under threat. It felt like he had been here before, like he had been caught in this kind of situation time and time again, only it was different this time. There were too many unknowns, too many things he didn't understand. As Jack moved closer to the group of men, his mind flashed back to his time in Afghanistan, to the years spent on the front lines. He remembered the missions, the reconnaissance, the long dark nights spent crouched in the dirt waiting for the enemy to make their move. He remembered the fear and the adrenaline, how every decision felt like life or death. And then he remembered the day his team had been betrayed, the day everything had gone wrong, the day that had changed him forever. His fingers clenched around his rifle as the memory hit him with full force. The sound of gunfire, the way his team had been ambushed in the middle of a mission they had thought was routine. The faces of the men who had died, their eyes wide with shock, with betrayal. He remembered their last words, their last moments before everything had gone black. The ghosts of his comrades had haunted him ever since. Their faces never left his mind. Was this what had led him here? Was this why he had been called back into the field? Because of the mistakes made all those years ago? But now wasn't the time to dwell on the past. Now wasn't the time to think about what had happened in the desert. Now there were real people, real threats to deal with. Jack gritted his teeth and pushed the thoughts aside, focusing on the present. He had a job to do. He had to stay focused. The answers were out there, and he wasn't going to stop until he found them. And just when Jack thought he couldn't feel more alone, he felt a shift in the air again. This time it wasn't just his instincts. It wasn't just the quiet tugging at the back of his mind. Echo was no longer beside him. Jack whipped around his heart, stopping in his chest. The dog was gone. Jack's breath caught in his throat as his heart rate spiked. The forest, once a familiar and steady presence around him, had suddenly turned hostile. The shadows felt deeper, darker, and now in the silence that surrounded him, he was acutely aware of the absence of Echo. The dog had been right there just moments ago, stiff alert, focused, but now he was gone. Vanished into the woods like a wisp of smoke, leaving Jack alone in a growing sense of unease. Echo Jack called, his voice more strained than he intended, but it was swallowed by the forest. His words bounced off the trees, fading into the darkness. No response. Just the wind whispering through the pines, distant and hollow. Jack's hands trembled slightly as he tightened his grip on his rifle. This wasn't like Echo. The dog never strayed from Jack's side, especially in situations like this. They were a team, a unit. Echo had never acted without Jack's command, unless there was something seriously wrong. And now that instinct to protect Jack, to stay with him, had been overridden. What was happening? The first flicker of doubt crept into Jack's mind, followed by a sinking feeling deep in his stomach. What if Echo had found something? What if the dog was leading him into a trap? It was an unsettling thought, but it wasn't one Jack could ignore. He had been in combat situations before, on edge in the night, surrounded by enemies he couldn't see, only hear the kind of fear that rattled your bones, made your pulse race with the knowledge that something was out there. This wasn't just a patrol or a routine mission. There was something off about this whole situation. Jack took a step forward, moving cautiously, listening for any sign of movement. The silence around him felt too thick, too deliberate. The deeper he went into the woods, the more oppressive the silence became, like the forest itself was holding its breath. It wasn't just the absence of Echo that unnerved him, it was the complete stillness. Even the usual sounds of wildlife had stopped. The birds had quieted, the rustle of leaves stilled. Then he heard it. The faintest sound, footsteps, light and quick brushing against the underbrush. Jack froze his body, going taut, his senses flaring. Echo, Jack whispered, but his voice felt hollow in the dead silence. His eyes scanned the dark forest, searching the shadows for any sign of his dog. Every muscle in his body screamed at him to move to find Echo, but his training held him in place. Reacting without thought would only get him caught. The sound came again, closer this time. It wasn't Echo's familiar, tread-heavy, but rhythmic. This was different, sharp and swift. Jack's mind raced as his eyes flicked toward the direction of the noise there, just beyond the clearing. A flash of movement. And then Echo appeared, emerging from the undergrowth like a shadow, his eyes locked on Jack with an intensity Jack couldn't remember seeing before. The dog's posture was stiff, every muscle tight, his body coiled like a spring ready to snap. Jack relaxed his grip on the rifle, exhaling sharply, but a new wave of unease hit him. Something had happened. Echo wasn't just coming back to him. The dog was alert, his body tense, as though the sight of Jack had pulled him from some other focus. Something had drawn him away. Jack didn't wait for Echo to come closer. He moved toward the dog, his boots crunching quietly on the forest floor. But as Jack stepped forward, something caught his eye movement, just a flicker but unmistakable. Someone was there in the shadows not far from where Echo had been. "Who's there?" Jack called out, his voice low but commanding. He felt the hairs on the back of his neck rise again. His hand hovered near the sidearm, but he kept his finger off the trigger, not wanting to make any rash moves. The figure didn't respond, didn't move. But Jack could feel the presence the way it lingered, watching, waiting. His instincts screamed at him to move, to act. But there was something too familiar about this feeling. Jack had been here before, in the deserts of Afghanistan, in the thick of the fight when the world turned against you and every shadow held a threat. But tonight it was different. The enemy wasn't clear, wasn't visible, and it felt like he was being hunted rather than doing the hunting himself. Echo's growl snapped Jack back to reality. The dog's eyes were still locked on the shadowed figure, his growl low but steady, a warning. Jack's heart raced again. The tension between them was palpable. Something was out there, something that made Echo uneasy, something that was watching them both. Jack's eyes darted between the shadows, and Echo, unsure of which threat was the more dangerous one. For a long, agonizing moment, the figure remained still motionless in the darkness. Then finally Jack saw a small shift in the shadows, just enough for him to catch the faint glint of metal, a rifle. It was faint but unmistakable. The figure was armed, and that was all Jack needed to know. Without hesitation, he moved, instinct taking over. "Echo, move." Jack barked, his voice urgent. But Echo didn't move. The dog stayed rooted in place, staring at the figure in the shadows. Jack's mind raced as he adjusted his position silently, making his way toward Echo. Every step was calculated, careful, no sound, no sudden movements. He had to keep the element of surprise on his side. But as he reached for Echo's collar, something happened. The dog whipped around fast as lightning and lunged. His teeth snapped through the air, aiming for the shadowed figure in front of him. "Echo, no," Jack shouted. But it was too late. The figure didn't flinch. Instead, there was a sharp metallic noise, something that sounded like a brief struggle, followed by a swift motion that sent Echo tumbling to the ground. Jack's heart stopped. The dog was down. And worse, there was no sound from Echo. No whine, no growl, just silence. Jack's body went rigid with shock. He was too far away to reach Echo in time, and the figure had the advantage, standing tall, weapon raised. This wasn't supposed to happen. Echo wasn't just his dog. He was his partner, his anchor in this chaotic, unforgiving world. He wasn't supposed to be taken down like that. But the figure didn't attack Jack. Not yet. Instead, they stood there, the shadow of their weapon falling over the dog's still form. Jack's chest tightened, his hand now, firmly gripping his rifle. He wasn't sure what was worse, the fact that Echo had been taken down or the silence that followed it. Everything in him wanted to charge forward to grab his dog and run, but that wasn't the plan. That wasn't the way it worked. The figure spoke, their voice muffled, but clear-cutting through the silence. "You've been warned, Sergeant Westbrook. This isn't your fight." The words hit Jack like a punch to the gut. He'd been warned. By whom? And why had they done this? Why now? For a long, brutal moment, Jack stood frozen, caught between anger and fear. He didn't move. His mind screamed for action, for revenge, but something deeper held him in place. The dog had been the only thing that had kept him grounded. Echo's presence had been the only thing he had left. And now the one thing he couldn't afford to lose was gone. But Jack wasn't about to let that stand. The voice from the shadows spoke again, and this time Jack's mind was already made up. It was time to move. To end this no matter the cost. The world seemed to slow as Jack stared at Echo motionless on the ground. The dog, his loyal companion, the one constant in Jack's turbulent life, was now lying there, his body limp and still. For a brief moment, time stopped entirely. Jack's heart stopped, his breath caught in his throat. He couldn't breathe, couldn't think. Echo wasn't dead. He couldn't be. But in the pit of Jack's stomach, the sharp stab of fear whispered that it didn't matter. His partner had been taken down so easily, like a fleeting thought, too fast, too violently for Jack to react. The shadows loomed over them both. The figure in front of him, now revealed more fully in the dim light of the moon, was tall, wiry, with the silhouette of a trained operative. The rifle was slung over his back, now his posture casual, almost dismissive. Jack's eyes tracked every detail, every inch of movement, but there was no hesitation. He had to act, no matter the cost. "Get away from him." Jack's voice came out low, barely above a whisper, a growl more than anything else. His pulse was thunderous in his ears. The figure's eyes flicked to Jack, but didn't flinch. "You're too late, Sergeant." The voice was flat-laced with something Jack couldn't place, a kind of cold certainty that made his blood run colder. "We've been watching you for a long time." Jack's fingers tightened on the rifle. "What do you want?" His words were more controlled than he felt, but the anger in his chest was like a furnace, threatening to burn through him. The sense of betrayal, the sense that his entire world was falling apart, it was all mixing together, threatening to overwhelm him. He had no answers, just more questions. And there was no way he was going to let this figure walk away with those answers. The figure tilted his head slightly, as though considering the question. "We want what's ours." There was no malice in the words, no threat in the way they were spoken. Just an eerie, unsettling calm. "But you, Sergeant, you're a complication, and complications tend to get in the way." The figure's eyes narrowed as they glanced toward Echo, still motionless on the ground. "Your dog got in the way." Jack's breath caught in his throat. His body tensed, ready to explode into action. He wanted to rush the figure, to tackle him to the ground and demand answers, but something in the back of his mind, something familiar, held him back. He knew better than to act recklessly. He'd seen too many soldiers die because they let their emotions drive them. The figure stepped forward, taking slow, deliberate steps toward Echo's body. Jack felt the weight of every moment stretching into eternity. Was this it? Had this been the plan all along? To break Jack before he even had a chance to fight back? The figure crouched down beside Echo, one hand reaching out to touch the dog's motionless form. Jack's muscles screamed to stop him, but he couldn't move. He couldn't breathe. He watched as the figure gently moved Echo's head, checking the dog's pulse if there was any pulse to check. "You've been part of a bigger game, Sergeant," the figure continued, standing up again. "A game you don't even understand. Your team, your missions, everything you've done, it's been manipulated. You just never saw the strings." Jack's mind raced. Manipulated. What the hell was he talking about? He thought back to the briefings, the endless meetings at the outpost, the classified reports, everything he'd been part of. He'd done what they asked. He had always followed orders, had always done his job. He hadn't questioned it. But now, hearing the figure speak, everything felt wrong. It was as if the rug had been pulled from under him. All those years, all those battles, the people he had fought beside it was starting to unravel. Had it all been a lie? Echo's soft whimper broke Jack's train of thought, pulling him back into the present. The dog was still breathing shallowly but alive. Jack's chest constricted with relief, but it was short-lived. The figure's hand was still hovering over Echo's head. It wasn't a threat. It was more like a reminder. A subtle gesture that the figure was in control, that Jack didn't have a say in what happened next. "I don't know what you're talking about," Jack said, his voice rough, but the fire of determination was back. His hands were shaking, but he wasn't going to back down. "Who are you, and what do you want with me?" The figure's lips curled slightly into something like a smile, but it didn't reach their eyes. "You don't get it, do you?" The voice dropped an octave, softening into something more dangerous. "The world you think you know, it's just a game, a facade. And you, Sergeant, you're a piece on the board. A pawn, if you will. And it's time you learned who's been pulling the strings." Jack's mind reeled. This wasn't just about some rogue group of mercenaries. This wasn't just about a random threat against the outpost. There was something far bigger at play here, something Jack couldn't even begin to understand. But the figure's words echoed through his mind like the warning bells of a coming storm. Suddenly, the figure straightened, his demeanor changing. "It's time to stop playing Westbrook. You've been part of this system for too long. But the game's over." His voice lowered almost to a whisper. "Now it's your turn to make a choice." Jack's stomach churned. Make a choice. What was he supposed to choose? What game was this man talking about? Jack had followed orders. He had done what was asked of him. But now it seemed like the world was falling apart around him, and he wasn't sure who was on his side anymore. "Whatever you think you're doing," Jack said, forcing his voice to remain steady despite the uncertainty gnawing at him, "you've made a mistake. I'm not your pawn." The figure smiled, but there was nothing kind about it. "We'll see, Sergeant. We'll see." And just like that, the figure turned and melted back into the shadows of the forest, vanishing without a trace, as though he had never been there at all. The silence that followed was deafening. Jack stood motionless, still processing the barrage of information, the lingering questions, the weight of the threat. He wanted to follow him, to find him, to force him to give answers. But there was no time. The dog Echo was still lying motionless in front of him. Jack's instincts kicked in. His dog was alive, but barely. The dog needed him now more than ever. Jack crouched beside Echo, gently running his fingers through the dog's fur, feeling for any signs of injury. But it wasn't just Echo who needed him. Jack needed answers, and he had a feeling he wasn't going to like the truth he uncovered. The cold air bit at Jack's skin as he knelt beside Echo, his heart still pounding in his chest. The dog's shallow breaths were a small relief, but Jack couldn't afford to let his guard down. Not now. Not when everything he knew was slipping through his fingers. The shadows seemed to stretch longer in the forest, the silence deeper, and with it the unsettling weight of unanswered questions pressed harder on his mind. Jack's fingers gently checked Echo's body for injuries, but all he found was exhaustion. The dog's pulse was weak but steady, a relief for now. Whatever the figure had done to him, it hadn't been enough to break the bond between man and beast. Echo was still here, still with him, but Jack had no illusions about what was happening. They were in danger, and it wasn't just from the men who had ambushed them. It was from something much bigger, something Jack couldn't even begin to understand. But there was one thing he did know: he was being dragged into something that had nothing to do with the mission he thought he was on. All these years, Jack had followed orders, performed the tasks asked of him. He'd never questioned the system that had guided his life. The briefings, the missions, the camaraderie with his team, they were all part of the same machine. But now that machine had turned on him. The figure's words echoed in his mind, the cold certainty in their voice. "You're a pawn, Sergeant. A piece on the board." For the first time, Jack wondered how much of his life had been his own. How many choices had he really made? How many had been made for him in the shadows by forces he couldn't see? But that didn't matter right now. Echo needed him. And Jack had a choice to make, one that had nothing to do with the shadowy figures and whispered threats. It was time to get out of the woods, to get Echo back to safety, to figure out what the hell was going on. But as he stood up, lifting Echo carefully, Jack couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. He scanned the darkness, his eyes flicking across the tree line, searching for any sign of movement. But there was nothing, just the quiet, oppressive silence of the woods. And then, just as he was about to turn back toward the outpost, a voice broke through the stillness. "Don't run, Sergeant," the voice called out from the shadows, smooth and cold. Jack's heart skipped in his chest, and he instinctively reached for his rifle. The figure stepped forward again, but this time Jack saw them clearly. A man tall and gaunt, dressed in dark tactical gear that blended perfectly with the night. His face was hidden behind a black mask, but his eyes, those cold, calculating eyes, were all Jack could see. "I wasn't going to run," Jack replied, his voice steady, despite the pounding in his chest. He couldn't let this man see his fear. He couldn't afford to show weakness. Not now. Not when he was so close to the answers. The figure tilted his head slightly, his eyes never leaving Jack. "You don't have a choice," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "You're already in too deep." Jack's mind raced. What did he mean, too deep? What was happening here? Who was this man, and why was he so certain that Jack had no way out? "You think you're just following orders," the figure continued, his voice mocking now. "You think your missions are just assignments. But they're not. You've been used, Sergeant, just like the rest of them." Jack's grip tightened on the rifle, his finger hovering over the trigger, but he didn't fire. He needed information. He needed to know who was behind all of this before he made his move. The man's words sent a chill through him, but he couldn't let himself fall into the trap. He'd been manipulated before by enemies, by the system, by his own mistakes. But he wasn't going to let it happen again. I've been used. By who? Jack asked, his voice controlled, but with an edge of desperation he couldn't hide. What do you know about me? The figure smiled, or at least Jack thought he did. It was hard to tell with the mask, but there was something about the way the man's shoulders relaxed, the way his stance shifted, that made Jack's blood run cold. This man knew something. Something that could destroy everything Jack had fought for. We know everything, Sergeant, the figure said, his tone suddenly serious. Everything you've done, everything you've been part of, and now you're going to help us clean up the mess. Jack's heart slammed in his chest as a wave of realization hit him. This wasn't just a random attack. This wasn't just some rogue group with a vendetta against the outpost. This was something planned. Something far more dangerous than anything he had ever faced before. These people, whoever they were, had been watching him, controlling him for longer than he could imagine. No, Jack said firmly, his voice cutting through the fear and confusion that threatened to overwhelm him. I don't know what kind of game you're playing, but I'm not helping you. Not now, not ever. The figure's smile faded, replaced by an expression of cold calculation. You don't have a choice, Sergeant. You're already in it, and we're going to finish it. Jack's pulse raced. He had never felt more trapped in his life. Every instinct told him to fight, to resist, to push back against the shadows that surrounded him. But in that moment, as the man's words echoed in his ears, Jack realized something that made his stomach drop. He was already too deep. The figure stepped forward, his hand moving toward the rifle slung across his chest. Jack's breath hitched. He couldn't let this man get any closer. If he did, there was no telling what would happen to him or to Echo. Before Jack could react, the figure raised a hand, signaling to someone in the distance. Jack's eyes darted to the edge of the clearing, and that's when he saw them. More men. More figures moving through the trees, their movements swift and coordinated. They were closing in from all sides surrounding him. In that moment, Jack knew that escape was no longer an option. They had him trapped. The figure smiled again, but this time it was different. There was no mockery in it, no amusement, just cold, hard certainty. You can resist all you want, Sergeant, he said softly, almost gently. But you can't fight us. You never could. Jack felt the weight of the truth settle in his chest like a stone. They had been watching him all along. They knew everything. And now it was too late to turn back. He was caught in the web they had spun, and there was no way out. But one thing was certain, Jack wasn't going to go down without a fight. Not now. Not after everything he had lost. Not while he still had Echo by his side. Jack's mind raced, his heart hammering against his chest as the circle of figures tightened around him. The night had turned suffocating, the air thick with tension. Every movement felt slow, deliberate, like they were all waiting for something. For him to make a move. For him to break. Echo was still at his side despite the earlier blow. The dog's breathing was shallow but steady, a small but constant reminder that Jack wasn't completely alone. The weight of the dog's presence, the unspoken bond between them, steadied Jack's resolve. But even that wasn't enough to push back the wave of dread that threatened to overtake him. The figure in front of him, still masked, still cold, spoke again, his words almost a whisper, but sharp enough to slice through the stillness of the night. You think you have a choice, Sergeant, but you don't. You're already a part of this. Jack felt the anger stir deep inside him, coiling like a snake ready to strike. I'm not a part of your game, he spat, his voice laced with defiance. You've got it all wrong. I don't know who the hell you think you are, but I'm not your pawn. And I'm not going to sit here while you... A sharp laugh cut him off, cruel and mocking. The figure stepped closer, tilting his head in that unnerving, calculated way. You don't get it, do you? His voice dropped, lowered, the edges of his words slicing through the quiet night. You've been playing the game all along. The missions, the kills, the betrayals, every single move you made was part of the plan. You just didn't know it yet. Jack's breath caught. The plan. The words echoed in his mind like a sickening drumbeat. All the years spent serving every operation, every mission, every lost comrade, were they all just part of this twisted scheme? Jack couldn't process it, couldn't fathom the truth that the figure was offering. He had to focus. Had to stop this madness before it consumed him. Who are you? Jack's voice came out harsher than he intended, his desperation seeping through. And why are you doing this? For a moment, there was silence. The figure said nothing, his face still hidden behind the mask, his posture relaxed but purposeful. Then, as if considering Jack's question, he spoke, each word deliberate. Let's just say we're the ones who clean up the mess, the figure said with chilling calm. You've been part of the cleanup crew too, Sergeant. You just didn't realize you were playing on the wrong side of the board. Jack felt his mind struggle to comprehend what was being said. Cleanup crew. What did that even mean? He hadn't been part of any cleanup crew. He had followed orders. He had done what was expected of him. But now it seemed like the whole world had flipped upside down. He wasn't the soldier he thought he was. Not anymore. Jack's eyes flicked toward Echo, who was still at his side, his body tense, but the dog remained eerily still. Jack couldn't let this go on any longer. He couldn't let them control him, couldn't let them take his life without understanding why it had come to this. He needed to act. Now. Without warning, Jack surged forward, his body moving on pure instinct. The rifle, once held loosely in his hands, was now raised, aiming straight at the figure in front of him. His heart raced as he shouted, "Back off!" Now the figure didn't flinch, didn't even blink. "Do it then," the man said, his voice eerily calm. "But you know it won't change anything." In that moment, something inside Jack snapped. He didn't care anymore about the plan, the game, or the twisted truth that had been uncovered. He only cared about what was right in front of him, what had always been right in front of him. Survival. Jack's finger tightened on the trigger. His rifle bucked against his shoulder, the sound of the shot splitting the air like a crack of thunder. But it wasn't the figure who fell. It was Echo. The dog yelped a harsh, painful sound, and Jack's heart stopped. Time seemed to stretch as he watched in horror as Echo stumbled forward, his body lurching with the force of the shot. The world spun around Jack, and for a moment he couldn't breathe. "No, Echo!" Jack screamed, dropping the rifle as he rushed forward. His heart pounded as he fell to his knees beside the dog, his hands trembling as he checked for the wound. Echo's body was warm, but blood seeped from a wound in the dog's side. His eyes were unfocused, but still full of life. "Still here. Stay with me," Jack whispered, his voice shaking. His hands were covered in the dog's blood, but he didn't care. Echo was all he had left. "Stay with me, boy." For a long moment there was no sound except Jack's frantic breathing and Echo's labored breaths. Then slowly the dog's head turned, his eyes meeting Jack's as though trying to reassure him even in this moment. It was that silent understanding, that bond between them, that had always kept Jack grounded. But then, just as suddenly, the world seemed to shift again. The shadowed figure stepped forward, moving as if the shot hadn't affected him at all. He raised a hand, but this time Jack was ready. The rifle was in his hand once more. He didn't care that the dog was bleeding out in his arms. He didn't care that the figure still had the upper hand. This was his fight now. "You'll regret that," the figure said, his voice cold and detached. "You don't know who you're dealing with." Jack's eyes locked onto the man's. "I know exactly who you are." His voice was low, steady now. "And I'm going to end this." In that moment, something inside Jack clicked, something deep, something primal. The mission, the threats, the lies, it all came crashing down around him. He wasn't a pawn. He wasn't anyone's tool. He was a soldier, yes, but he was also a man who had lost everything and was willing to fight for what little remained. He raised his rifle again, the motion fluid, instinctual. This time, when the shot rang out, it wasn't aimed at the figure. It was aimed at the equipment. The man's rifle exploded into the dirt, rendering it useless. The figure's expression shifted, the first sign of uncertainty Jack had seen. "You're out of moves," Jack said quietly, his voice cutting through the silence like a blade. The figure's hands fell to his sides, and for the first time, the mask seemed to waver. But Jack wasn't done yet. He wasn't going to let them win. Not after everything. Not after Echo. "Who are you?" Jack demanded again, his grip tight on the rifle, his eyes never leaving the man in front of him. The figure's shoulders slumped slightly. For the first time, he didn't speak, and Jack didn't need him to. There were no more games, no more manipulation. The truth was clear now. Whoever these people were, they were part of a larger conspiracy, one Jack had never been meant to uncover. But now he had, and that was enough. Echo stirred in his arms, his tail twitching slightly, a soft whimper escaping his throat. Jack's heart swelled with both relief and grief. The dog wasn't gone yet. They still had a chance. "You'll have your answer soon enough," Jack said, his voice more controlled now. "But first we're getting out of here." The figure didn't move. Jack didn't wait for him to respond. He turned, lifting Echo gently into his arms, and began to move back toward the outpost. He knew there would be more questions, more enemies. But for now he had something that mattered more than anything else. He had his survival, he had his dog, and he had his purpose back. As the night settled into a tense quiet behind him, Jack Westbrook knew that this was just the beginning. But whatever came next, he was ready. He wasn't anyone's pawn. Not anymore. Jack walked through the woods with Echo in his arms, the night air cool against his skin, the weight of the rifle on his back, a constant reminder of the battle he had just faced. The world around him was still, as if it had held its breath for too long, and was now exhaling in slow, cautious waves. The man in the shadows was gone, but the weight of his words lingered, gnawing at Jack's mind. "You've been playing the game all along. You just didn't know it." The words echoed in his ears, even as he walked away from the forest, away from the darkness that had almost claimed him and Echo. He hadn't asked for any of this, hadn't asked to be part of whatever twisted conspiracy the figure had hinted at. But now Jack knew there was no turning back. The world he had known, the world where his orders had always made sense, was unraveling. Every mission, every movement, every person he had ever trusted was now shrouded in uncertainty. He stopped for a moment, looking down at Echo. The dog's breathing had steadied his body, still weak but alive. Echo's eyes met Jack's, and for a moment there was nothing else in the world. Just the two of them. Just this bond, untouched by the shadows, untarnished by the lies that had followed them both for so long. Jack's fingers brushed against the dog's fur, a small gesture, but it spoke volumes. Echo had been his anchor, his constant in the chaos of war, the one being he could trust without question. And tonight, Echo had been the one to remind him of something he had nearly forgotten, the strength that came from loyalty, from the bond between them, from fighting for something bigger than just survival. As they moved forward, Jack's thoughts turned to the future. He didn't know what lay ahead, what new dangers or truths would unfold. But one thing was clear, he wouldn't face it alone. Echo had always been there by his side, and that would never change. The quiet between them was a comfort now. There was no need for words. The silence held something stronger, understanding. Jack didn't need to be told what to do next. He already knew. He had made his choice. They would face whatever came next together. Jack's footsteps were steady as he walked toward the outpost, the night stretching endlessly ahead of them. There were still questions to answer, a web of deceit to untangle, and enemies yet to confront. But he wasn't afraid. Not anymore. The truth, no matter how dark or twisted, was a path he would walk to the end. He would fight for it. For Echo. For the men he had lost. And for the truth that had always been buried, waiting to be uncovered. In the end, that was what mattered most. The fight for what was right, the willingness to face the truth no matter the cost. Because some battles aren't fought on the front lines. Some are fought in the silence between breaths, in the quiet understanding of a bond that can never be broken. And that was enough. Jack and Echo disappeared into the night, their steps unhurried, their mission clear. The world was still waiting. But for now, Jack Westbrook was exactly where he needed to be. True strength isn't found in the weapons we wield or the battles we win. It's found in the moments of silence, in the connections we forge with those who stand by us, even when the world tries to tear us apart. Jack's journey wasn't about defeating an enemy, it was about uncovering the truth of his own life, his own purpose. And in the end, he found that redemption doesn't come from the fight alone, but from the choices we make when the silence speaks louder than the noise of the world around us.